Mexico will dominate the 2030s, and the United States needs it to happen. The US-China rivalry sits at the center of the current geopolitical landscape, and as tensions escalate, Mexico is poised to become America's most crucial ally in maintaining global economic supremacy. With over 80% of its exports destined for the U.S. market, Mexico's financial ties to its northern neighbor are already deeply entrenched. This interdependence could be the most powerful alliance in the global economic order. But some really interesting challenges stand in the way. The fundamentals of Mexico's economy are some of the best on the planet. They have the perfect storm of demographic, geographic, and political factors to unlock massive investments. Mexico's workforce is relatively young and a crucial asset for economic growth. There will be a substantial labor pool for years to come and a generation of spenders forming new families and saving for retirement. As developed nations grapple with aging populations, Mexico's youthful workforce stands ready to meet the demand for manufacturing capacity in the West. As China's cost of labor and tensions with the Western world rise, Mexico is perhaps the most viable alternative for nearshoring manufacturing. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement ensures that Mexican goods can be exported to the U.S. without tariffs, enhancing the country's competitiveness. And foreign investors are taking notice of Mexico's potential. In 2023, foreign direct investment in Mexico surged by 41% compared to the previous year. This influx of capital signals growing confidence in Mexico's economic prospects. As companies seek to diversify their supply chains and reduce reliance on China, they could turn the country into a manufacturing powerhouse. However, Mexico's path to prosperity has some major hurdles. 56% of the country's labor force is working outside the formal economy. That means nearly half of all the workers creating market value are not quantified, regulated, or taxed. This limits their access to financial services, leading a lot of Mexicans to be underbanked. As a result, there's less capital for banks to lend out, which further hinders development. Crime and violence also remain persistent issues, threatening both public safety and investor confidence. The Mexican government must implement effective strategies to combat organized crime and improve security to fully capitalize on its economic potential. Additionally, wealth inequality continues to be a pressing concern, with a significant portion of the population living in poverty despite the country's overall economic growth. Despite these challenges, Mexico's economy has demonstrated remarkable resilience. It has weathered economic crises better than any of its South American counterparts. A strong economy with some strategic advantages that we're about to get into position Mexico to thrive in the decade ahead. This video is brought to you by MyHeritage, the #1 family history service, with over 20 billion documents and more than 90 million users worldwide. I didn't know what to expect when I created my account, but I built my own family tree easily. And after adding a couple of my immediate relatives, I used MyHeritage to find marriage certificates, census data, birth records, and obituaries. Thanks to instant discoveries, I found out which generation of my ancestors immigrated from Europe to the United States, which is the kind of thing that I thought had been lost to history. It's really nice to discover things that I never knew about my family tree. MyHeritage also has a tool that takes old black and white or damaged photos and restores them in seconds, or even animates the photos. Look at how it transformed this photo of my great-grandmother. I only knew one of my grandparents, so this is a revelation. By knowing where my family came from, I have a clearer picture of where I'm going. Sign up today with the link below for a 14-day free trial and start building your family tree with MyHeritage. Now back to the video. As Claudia Sheinbaum steps in to succeed current President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a battle for the soul of Mexican democracy is brewing. Sheinbaum's campaign slogan, "Continuity with Change," encapsulates the delicate balance she must strike. As AMLO's handpicked candidate, she represents the continuation of his populist policies that have resonated with many Mexicans. However, her background as a climate scientist suggests a pivot towards a more technocratic approach to governance and a focus on sustainability. With AMLO's party, Morena, poised to secure a supermajority in Congress, the stage is set for significant constitutional reforms. This concentration of power could be a double-edged sword, enabling swift implementation of progressive policies while simultaneously raising concerns about the erosion of checks and balances. Under AMLO's presidency, public approval of government institutions has surged. A striking 61% of Mexicans now express confidence in the national government, up from a mere 29% when he took office. Why was it so low? Well, for most of modern Mexican history, it was effectively a one-party state. The Institutional Revolutionary Party held uninterrupted power in the country for 71 years, from 1929 to 2000. That's not a recipe for good governance. It also means that Mexican democracy is extremely young and fragile. When polled, a majority of Mexicans express skepticism that democracy is even the optimal form of being governed. And the jury's still out on which direction things will go when AMLO steps down. He was a charismatic guy. Sheinbaum's more of a stoic professor. While AMLO is focused on traditional energy sources and populist economic policies, Sheinbaum's scientific background suggests a potential shift towards more green initiatives. One of the most pressing challenges facing the next administration will be addressing the country's ongoing struggle with crime and violence. AMLO responded to the crisis with increasing militarization. The armed forces have taken on a more prominent role in various aspects of public life, from infrastructure projects to law enforcement. While this has been justified as a necessary measure to combat corruption and improve efficiency, it has raised concerns about the long-term implications for civil institutions and democratic norms. If she gets it right, the Mexican economy could explode higher. But this is a gnarly problem. Drug cartels have become a major obstacle to Mexico's goals. These groups are deeply embedded in society and often work with the government rather than being in direct conflict. They are enormous, sprawling enterprises with a diverse collection of assets and incomes. Mexican drug trafficking organizations dominate the U.S. heroin market, with almost all heroin seized in the U.S. originating in Mexico. Heroin production and trafficking occur primarily in the country's northwestern states. In recent years, drug traffickers have shifted their focus to fentanyl, as it is cheaper and less labor-intensive to produce than heroin. Mexican drug traffickers are also major players in the global cocaine trade, acting as brokers and transporters of the drug worldwide. Cocaine originating in South America transit to Mexico on its way to the U.S. and increasingly to the EU. Territorial disputes in Central America and Colombia over control of northbound cocaine shipment routes to the U.S. have resulted in high levels of violence across Mexico. That violence requires weapons, and the cartels have become extremely proficient at acquiring the illegal arms that they need. The vast majority of seized illicit arms can be traced back to manufacturers in the United States. This issue has become a point of contention in U.S.-Mexico relations, with Mexican authorities launching civil lawsuits against U.S. arms manufacturers. While there's been an increase in weapon seizures along the U.S.-Mexico border, this has not significantly reduced the supply of weapons to domestic criminal groups in Mexico. This is one of the most anti-fragile systems on the continent. In Afghanistan, the Taliban was funded by drug money. Same thing for Chechen rebels in Russia and multiple other rebel groups around the world. If you can earn revenue through drug sales, launder that money, and acquire weapons outside of government taxation or regulation, you have all the fundamental components of a sustained insurgency. AMLO understood this risk and responded by significantly expanding the military's role in public life. Over 100 functions previously handled by civilian authorities have been transferred to the armed forces. One expert notes the military is now the largest and most powerful it has ever been. Yet, there is minimal evidence that the temperature is coming down. The homicide rate in Mexico increased by 76% from 2015 to 2021, with a peak of 26.6 deaths per 100,000 people. For the last 3 years, that number has been falling, but not as fast as it rose over the previous half-decade. This has largely been driven by competition between the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels for control over those key smuggling routes and border crossings into the United States. And a civil war within the Sinaloa cartel could escalate things even further. Now, neither side wants to go to war with their state governments. They just want to control the supply chains that influence their profits. And it's really hard to pin down exactly how much money is in this business. One U.S. government report estimates that somewhere between $6 billion and $29 billion annually has gone from the U.S. to Mexico over the last 15 years for illegal drugs. Yet, the entire Mexican drug industry employs just about 175,000 people. That's just 0.3% of Mexico's labor force. If you could successfully shut it all down, it wouldn't roil the Mexican economy. And you could even argue that a drop in crime would be more than made up for in foreign investment into Mexican manufacturing and industry. But that would take a complete overhaul of the judicial system, further militarization, and a massive improvement in coordination between Mexican and U.S. authorities. That's a huge lift. Now, if there was ever a time for Mexico and the United States to coordinate, this is it. For decades, American manufacturing has been hollowed out by globalization. But now that China is the leading global manufacturing powerhouse, U.S. policymakers are looking for an alternative. The issue is American workers are some of the most expensive labor, and land isn't exactly cheap. That makes it really hard to stand up a new manufacturing facility without a ton of robots and automation. That is one of the U.S.'s big bets to replace Chinese manufacturing, but it's not the only one. America is also looking to nearshore or friendshore a lot of its manufacturing. 2023 was the first time in 2 decades that Mexico's exports to the United States surpassed those from China. Ensuring tariff-free access for Mexican goods to the U.S. market, there should be a stable framework of economic cooperation for decades to come. Prior to the USMCA, the country spent decades in an economic union under NAFTA. Prior to that, Mexico had been under the de facto umbrella of U.S. military protection thanks to the Rio Treaty and the Monroe Doctrine. This means the capital should be comfortable making long-term investments to foster deeper integration of the North American economies. And Mexico's proximity to the U.S. also translates into lower transportation costs, faster delivery times, and easier communication between manufacturers and their customers. There's just one other issue. Manufacturing requires a lot of power. Mexico's energy landscape tells a tale of immense potential hampered by mismanagement. Despite sitting on proven oil reserves of nearly 6 billion barrels, Mexico is on track to become a net energy importer in the near future. How did a country with such vast resources end up in such a precarious position? At the heart of the story lies the Cantarell oil field, once a crown jewel of Mexico's petroleum industry. Discovered in 1976, the Cantarell field was a geological wonder. At its peak in 2004, it was the second largest oil field in the world by production, pumping out a staggering 2.1 million barrels per day. This single field accounted for more than half of Mexico's entire oil production. But the glory days of Cantarell didn't last. By 2019, production had plummeted to just 158,000 barrels per day, a mere 7.5% of its peak, as the easiest to exploit reserves dried up. What happened? The answer lies in Pemex, Mexico's state-owned oil company. For over half a century, Pemex has been plagued by mismanagement, corruption, and a lack of investment into new technologies and exploration. Instead of reinvesting profits into maintaining and expanding production, successive Mexican governments have used Pemex as a cash cow, siphoning off its revenues to fund other areas of the budget. This short-sighted approach has left the company struggling with massive debt and unable to keep pace with the evolving global energy landscape. As a result, Mexican crude oil production has been in steady decline for over a decade. In 2006, the country was producing 3.3 million barrels per day. By 2020, the figure had dropped to just 1.7 million barrels. This decline in production, coupled with increasing domestic energy demand, has put Mexico on a collision course with energy insecurity. The country now faces the prospect of relying on foreign sources to meet its energy needs. Without a stable and sufficient energy supply, Mexico's ambitions of becoming a global manufacturing powerhouse could be severely hampered. Energy is the lifeblood of industry, and an unreliable or expensive energy supply could drive away the very investments Mexico is hoping to attract. It also makes the country extremely vulnerable to price shocks and geopolitical pressures. The irony is, Mexico has all the resources to be energy independent and even a major exporter. country has significant yet untapped oil reserves, abundant renewable energy potential, and a strategic location for energy trade. If you wanted to do a comprehensive overhaul of Mexico's energy industry, you'd start by modernizing and maybe privatizing Pemex to improve its operational efficiency. Unlock investment into exploration and production technologies to boost output from existing fields and discover new ones. But new President Sheinbaum is a former climate scientist who's written academic papers on transitioning away from fossil fuels and reducing emissions. This just doesn't seem aligned with her goals. If she has another plan to solve Mexico's energy puzzle, I'm all ears. This is what will determine their economic trajectory in the coming decade. Get it right, and I think you could see Mexican GDP skyrocket from around $11,000 to over $20,000. But without a secure, efficient energy sector, the country's ambitions may remain frustratingly out of reach. Thank you again to MyHeritage for sponsoring today's video. As a reminder, go sign up for the 14-day free trial using the link below. You'll be able to enjoy all the amazing features of MyHeritage, the access to historical documents, building out your family tree, all the instant discoveries. Go check it out. Now, Mexico will continue to experience some growth over the next decade. That in and of itself will make it an outlier in a world that is deglobalizing. We've previously made videos about how that's a really bad thing for countries like Germany and Brazil that you can watch next.